Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancto.
Pope Francis will be laid to rest on Saturday at the St. Mary Major Basilica Church. Cardinals met at the Vatican today to plan the funeral, which is expected to see world leaders attend. The 88-year-old head of the Catholic Church died yesterday after suffering a stroke and cardiac arrest. The Pope's body is expected to be taken to St. Peter's Basilica tomorrow, where the public can pay their final respects. Thousands have gathered at St. Peter's Square since his passing. And human rights communications specialist with the Outright International, Matuba Mahlatjie, joins us now to look at the Pontiff's legacy and compassion towards the LGBTIQIA+ community. Matuba, good evening and welcome to the program. Thanks for your time. Who can forget the question that Pope Francis posed in July 2013 that sent shockwaves across the Catholic world when asked about gay priests, saying, if they accept the Lord and have goodwill, who am I to judge them? It was a moment that signaled a shift towards a more accepting tone within the Church. How important was that moment to the LGBTIQA+ community?
Hi, good morning, Iman, and thank you for having us. And let me start by passing on our sincere condolences to the Catholic Church at large here at home and globally, especially to LGBTQ Catholic Church members as well. And, you know, Pope Francis's stance on LGBTQ people was an important step forward for acceptance. And of course, I mean, for people who are Catholic or who are religious, this was important for them to be able to get the blessing for same-sex relations. And, you know, the late Pope understood the power and influence of being a leader of more than 1 billion followers. And the Vatican has political influence, and it's a fact that many religious leaders today condone discrimination and sometimes, you know, even violence against LGBTQ people. So to have the Pope as a world leader call for respect and dignity for same-sex couples and increased recognition of LGBTQ people is an important step forward towards tolerance and acceptance. And I think it's a legacy that we want to hold on when we think about Pope Francis. And in his own words, as you say, Iman, you know, who am I to judge? Is something that LGBTIQ people, especially trans and non-binary people, needed to hear from someone like Pope Francis, because homophobia and transphobia are embedded in church structures, and that apparatus is largely intact.
Well, you've set it up nicely for my next question, Matuba, because Pope Francis's predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI, by contrast, was anything but a friend to the community. He was accused, or the LGBTIQA+ community, he was accused of objectively demonizing the queer community. In 1992, as head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, he authored an official Vatican declaration on gay rights. It was quite a detailed document, Matuba, and it stated a raft of things, among which was that homosexual orientation was an objective disorder and a tendency ordered towards an intrinsic moral evil. And by the way, it's a document we understand is still official Vatican policy today. So for Pope Francis to come against that backdrop and preach the doctrine of tolerance and inclusivity to the extent that he could was stark.
Yeah, and, you know, Iman, and this is why I'm saying, you know, the transphobia and homophobia exist in church structures, and it's still very much intact. And it's precisely because of, you know, writings like that from the previous Pope. And now with Pope Francis gone, we wait and see if the next Pope will go back to the Pope Benedict or the Pope John Paul days when there was no acknowledgement at all for LGBTQ people. But sometimes something I think is important to note is that Pope Francis did not just act out of compassion. He also knew that in many parts of the world, including here in Africa, conversion practices, particularly those with a religious basis, have been used to attempt to change or suppress a person's sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. these practices are based on the incorrect assumption that LGBTQ identities are social, religious, or biological aberration that people need to be relieved from, as that text from Pope Benedict suggests. And there's research out there, Iman, and we know that Pope Francis believes in science because of his stance on climate change. So it would not be surprising that he was privy to research that shows religious-based convergent practices often lead to internalized stigma and negative associations of pain and discomfort with LGBTQ identities, and causing LGBTQ people like me, to experience significant mental and emotional suffering. These practices have been described as, a violation of the global ban on torture and inhuman treatment.
It's a really serious reflection there, Matuba, on what happens and the kind of trauma that is then perpetuated in these settings in church. And you need a leader, you need somebody who will stand up and will move things and steer things in a different direction. You touched on that slightly, who's next, and whether some of the reforms, because we talk about the way that the church is administered, the way that its finances are kept secret. He talked about creating more transparency and opening the door effectively, and we know that by the conduct of his life as well, chose to live in a very simplistic way, which is a quick, which is a stark departure from some of the opulence that is associated with the Vatican and the Catholic Church. What are some of your concerns? And one expects that you will be watching the conclave quite closely then.
Yeah, well, because it's a secret passion I have, actually, because I love, European royal houses, and I love the Vatican.
Why am I not surprised?
Anyway, story for another day. But Iman, in terms of who the next pope will be, I want to also highlight that, Pope Francis's very progressive, compassionate approach also showed the world that there are limitations in the papal office. So, and I personally think we were better off with Pope Francis still alive and advocating for tolerance and acceptance, and an association of Catholic bishops on the continent opposed Pope Francis's decision to approve non-liturgical blessings for gay couples, describing it as inappropriate. So there was no way of Pope Francis to enforce this. And now I don't want to speculate, but now we wait and see if we are going to get somebody who's going to continue the legacy that Pope Francis left behind. But also, Iman, can I just get an opportunity to also highlight this, that, religious leaders are not the lifeline really for all of us as LGBTQ people, and not undermining Pope Francis's legacy and what he's done for us, because there are still 65 countries in the world that criminalize same-sex relations, and this is a holdover from colonial era. And we've seen like a few countries get rid of these laws in recent years, and that is incredibly important. But the fact that there are still 65 countries that criminalize same-sex is critical, and we have seen countries moving towards making not just same-sex relations themselves illegal, but basically making it more difficult for people to join organizations to speak about what it means to be LGBTQ. So Pope Francis, directly or not, his message was important to reach across the world among Catholics, but also among other world leaders, to see that there is a way forward towards acceptance and tolerance. And even though they were, unrepentant leaders despite the Pope's stance. So I think we believe, as the global LGBTIQ movement, that a message like that from a powerful person like Pope Francis will at least curb some of the most discriminatory and violent ways that we see, and the hate towards people has spread in many places. So we hope the new Pope will also continue that legacy, so that we don't start from scratch, as we see with the world, as we see with the US funding that has changed livelihoods across, human rights activists around the world. People have lost livelihoods completely, and this is because of poor politics and people who refuse to see things for what they really are.
Matuba Mahlatjie, thanks for your reflections on this, and for, again, appreciating the contribution that the late Pontiff has had on the freedoms that the LGBTIQA+ communities can enjoy.